So I want to talk with you about what I think is one of the most important passages in Scripture. And of course, this is leading up to Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection. And as we're getting ready to celebrate Easter in that time of season here, I want to talk a bit to you from John 13. This is where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. I'm just going to read a few verses here and then kind of want to break it down a little bit. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things unto his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So I'll stop right there. And I want to reflect on that for just a moment. I think this is an extraordinarily important topic because I'm a leadership coach. It's what I do professionally. And so I look through the eyes or the lens of leadership, and I look for that in everything. It could be a college football coach and how he leads his team and these kind of things. The most important aspect of leadership is humility. And I believe that what we're reading right here is his desire to impart upon these 12 guys, ultimately 11, who he is tasking with the goal of changing the world. Can you imagine how insurmountable that was? These 12 guys, or 11, are going to go change the world. So he had to teach them something that night about how to lead people, because you can't lead people. You can't certainly affect change if you can't lead. And Jesus taught them the most important aspect of leadership, and that is humility. And I think this passage is just so rich and full of that. First, you kind of have to understand the climate. Typically, people had the ability to bathe in those days by like a sponge or a cloth, and they would spritz their bodies off. They rarely washed their feet because as soon as they were bathed, they would have to go from a house to another building or something. Streets weren't paved. Even the floors of a lot of buildings were just dirt. So your feet were always dirty. And think about this. Because they didn't have the infrastructure that we have with sewers and things, that kind of thing, when they walked through their feet, typically would open sandals, those kind of things, they're stepping in excrement and all kinds of filth. So feet were dirty. So when you went to have dinner with somebody, a special guest, typically the lowest servant in the house would wash their feet so that their feet wouldn't stink or they would appear dirty sitting around the table. So it's really important to understand that, how dirty people's feet got. Jesus intentionally kept servants out of this room. It was just him and his disciples, and he washed their feet. He even washed Judas' feet. This is an amazing moment. Stephen Collins, in his great book, Good to Great, says that a level 5 leader, or the top level of leader, he describes that person as a paradoxical blend of personal humility and indomitable will. And we see that right here. Such personal humility. Jesus washed their feet to teach them they should be humble and serve each other. He says, Peter says to him in verse 8, says to him, "You shall not wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Then Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean." And then on in verse 15, Jesus says, "For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done." He calls this act an example, ruling it out as a sacrament, but it is an example of how we are to treat each other and how we are to lead. The great writer Alexander Maclaren said this, and I quote, "Nowhere else nowhere else is his speech at once so simple and so deep. Nowhere have we the heart of God so unveiled to us. The immortal words which Christ spoke in that room are his highest self-revelation in speech, even as the cross to which they led up to is his most perfect self-revelation in act. So I just want you to think about the act of being humble, of having a servant's heart. If you're a leader of people, you must have a servant's heart to truly lead people. If you're not a leader, you still should serve people. Jesus is clearly demonstrating here that serving each other is what we're about. If He, God, in the form of a man, can drop to His knees and wash the filth off of His disciples' feet, I think the least we can do is serve those around us in a loving way.